So we're in this series where we're talking all about mental health. And even though it's hard to talk about this stuff sometimes, it can be really heavy, it can be really deep. I'm so grateful that we're diving into this topic because the reality is that so many of us struggle with this. And if I'm being honest with you guys, I'm actually coming out of a season where I was dealing with a bout of depression. And it really stinks. It's hard, it's sad, it makes you feel really low and dark. And actually, there's a lot of people in the Bible who struggled with things like depression, or maybe not even necessarily depression, but also things like just going through really dark times, dealing with really heavy emotions, dealing with some really sad stuff. It's in the Bible everywhere. And I actually want to tell you guys about one guy who was struggling with this. And his name was Jeremiah. So Jeremiah was a prophet called by God to go to the people of Israel and basically tell them that they needed to stop living the way that they were living. So Jeremiah does this. He goes to these people and he tells them, and what ends up happening is they pretty much ignore him. So what happened is God allowed these people called the Babylonians to kind of overtake their city and to take them into exile and put them into slavery and to torture them and kill them. And it was really brutal. And the thing about this is not only was Jeremiah upset about this because these were people that he cared about, this was also his home. This was his land. This was his people. And so he's not only heartbroken to see what's happening, but he's heartbroken over this place that's his too. And so I actually want to pick up in Lamentations where we hear Jeremiah kind of crying out about what he's going through. This is what he says. He says, "The thought of my suffering and homelessness is bitter beyond words. I will never forget this awful time as I grieve over my loss." Okay, how many of you can already relate to some of the things he's saying? How many of you can think about a time in your life when something you were going through was so painful and so hard that you didn't even have the words to put to it? Or how many of you can think about a time in your life that you were going through something so difficult that you said to yourself, "I will never forget this"? And so this stuff is so relatable. But what's crazy is we kind of see Jeremiah totally change his tone in these next sentences, all in the same breath. And so watch this. He says, "Yet I still dare to hope when I remember this. The faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh each morning. I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance. Therefore, I will hope in him." His mercies are afresh and new each morning. What that means is that despite the fact that we're imperfect humans who don't deserve the things that God does for us, he does it anyway. He shows up. He puts that podcast in front of you. He sends a friend to say something to you that you really needed to hear. He puts that verse in front of you. He plays make sure that song is on the radio that you really need to hear, that lifts you up. Guys, those are the little things that we can see God's faithfulness, the ways that he tells us that he is near to us, even in the really dark times. And I want to give you guys an example of, in my life, in that season of depression I just came out of, what God's faithfulness looked like for me. Randomly one day, as I'm in this season of feeling that way, I decided to listen to this podcast by one of my favorite Christian speakers. Her name's Sadie Robertson. If you know her, shout out to Sadie. And this podcast was her interviewing a psychiatrist. And he gave some incredible tools that I used in that season that really helped carry me through and helped maybe not take it away, but make that time a lot easier and a lot more bearable. The first thing that he said was, where you bring your attention determines how you will feel. So what he is saying in this moment, he's talking about how if all you do is focus on all the things that are going wrong, then you're not going to feel happy. But if you can turn your attention to the things that are going right, that is going to make a big difference. Now, I know that might sound really simple, but reality is think about when you're going through a hard time, how you tend to just only think about all the bad things going on. And if you actually challenge yourself to try to think about the right things that are happening, despite all the things that are going wrong, I want you to ask yourself how much it changes your heart, how much it changes how you feel. I tried this and it actually made a really big difference. So that's the first thing. The second thing is when we're in a season where we're feeling really low and really sad and going through something really hard, we tend to think that if we just had more of this, or if we just had more of that, we'd be happier. If we were rich, or if we just had fame, if we just had more, we would be happier. But what he talked about is the fact that actually the most famous people and the most rich people in the world actually tend to be the most sad people in the world. And he talked about the reason for that is because there's a pleasure center in our brain that all of us have. And when that pleasure center gets hit too often with too much money or too much fame, all of a sudden it needs more and more and more and more and more of those things to ever feel happy because it just gets too used to it. And so what that means, the good news for us about that is that we already have everything we need to be happy. We don't need more. In fact, getting more can actually be worse. And so focus on what you do have. Focus on who God created you to be and the fact that you have all you need because of Jesus and because of how he created you and wired you. That is good enough. And what you need to know is that you can be happy. So look for God's faithfulness in your life. Look for the ways he's showing up. Focus on the things that are right, not just the things that are wrong. And remember that even when our feelings change, God's faithfulness remains. Thanks, guys.